Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. On behalf of Critical Connections, Karuna Center for Peacebuilding, and the League of Women Voters, Springfield, I'd like to welcome you all to our event today. My name is Mehlaqa Samdani. I'm the Director of Critical Connections, an organization here in the Valley that puts together events that offer analysis and opportunities for dialogue on issues related to American Muslims and other minority groups. So our event today is part of the Building Inclusive Community series that we launched with the Karuna Center for Peacebuilding last year. And the idea is for us to engage with public sector officials, be they educators, religious clergy, law enforcement, refugee resettlement agencies, to explore how to make these particular sectors more inclusive and more responsive to the needs of a diverse population. And so our event today is going to facilitate a similar conversation. Last December, we had an event where we focused on the role of faith leaders on how to make their congregations more inclusive, both within their congregations and outside in the larger community. And today, in the context of law enforcement and communities of color, we hope to have a similar conversation to really understand what are the structural and societal shifts that are necessary to improve relations. So today, you're going to hear from community activists, academics, scholars, law enforcement personnel, to understand and have a greater understanding of the structural context in which these interactions take place, to understand what community concerns and grievances are with respect to law enforcement, and to really have a greater understanding of local initiatives that law enforcement agencies have begun to build trust and to address some of the structural issues that we face. Also, we realize that here within the room, there is a lot of expertise, there's a lot of knowledge, and so we would love to hear from all of you because this is going to be a very interactive conversation, to please contribute to the conversation and advance it. And in the process, we'll try and identify amazing community resources that we have that we hope will be able to facilitate and foster improved relations. So before I introduce our incredible and very esteemed keynote speaker, Mr. Rahsaan, who joins us from Boston, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Mason, Program Manager at Karuna Center, to identify the goals and objectives of today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'll just speak louder. As Mehlaqa said, I'm Rachel Mason. I'm the Karuna Center for Peacebuilding Program Manager, and I'm so delighted to see everyone here today. I bring greetings to you from Olivia Dreyer, whose name is in your program. She's currently in Rwanda, where yesterday she was part of a national listening session with government officials as part of our Healing Our Communities program there. She's the executive director of the Karuna Center, and she sends her regards. Before we begin today, I want to tell you a little bit about what we hope this symposium will be. First, I'd like to tell you what it's not intended to be. This isn't a training per se. You're not going to get a certificate at the end. You won't be getting academic credit for this. This also isn't a mediation or negotiation between two rebel groups. We're not looking for a peace treaty here. It's not a presentation of solutions, although we do hope that collectively we might be able to identify some best practices and maybe think of new approaches to address unmet needs. This also isn't a panel of experts. Many of the people who came today just as participants are just as qualified as our panelists to speak about these issues, and many of you who are sitting here today would have different perspectives that maybe our panelists won't even be able to speak to. Think of our panelists more as people who we've invited to get the conversation started. Hopefully we'll also get to hear all of your voices, your concerns, your questions, and your valuable ideas during times like the Q&A sessions, the small group, and the plenary sessions this afternoon. This also isn't a comprehensive convening of everyone in Western Massachusetts with a stake in this issue. We know that not everyone is able to attend a full-day symposium on a Friday, though of course we also know that if we held this on a weekend or an evening, other people would be excluded from it as well. We appreciate who is in the room, but we also know that there are others who aren't in the room today. And finally, this isn't the first discussion on this topic in Western Massachusetts, and it won't be the last either. So that's what it isn't. So what today is, or at least what we're hoping it will be, as Mehlaqa said, part of our goal is to examine some of the structural and political barriers that can negatively impact relations between law enforcement and communities of color. We'd also like to do some appreciative inquiry and ask what's already out there that law enforcement is trying, that communities are trying, what's working, what can we build on? And also identify some of the gaps that are perhaps not yet met by some of these initiatives, some of the gaps that might be causing some of these otherwise good initiatives to not work as well as they could, and think collectively about what we might be able to do to address some of those gaps. At the core of the Karuna Center's work is engaging people across divides, bringing people together to build sustainable peace at all levels of society. We do this in far-flung places like Rwanda or Myanmar or Pakistan, but we also believe that it's important to address issues here in our own backyard, and we're thrilled to host this event today along with Critical Connections and the League of Women Voters. Just a few logistical details before we move on. First of all, about today's program, you have the schedule in the program. We'll start with our distinguished keynote speaker, followed by 2 panels to round out the morning. We've asked our speakers and our moderators to leave 30 minutes at the end of each of those. Oh, that's better. Is that better for people? Yes? Okay. All right. Thank you. So we've asked our speakers and moderators to leave some time at the end, leave a fair amount of time at the end of each of the panels for questions and comments. During the short breaks between panels, we invite you to stop over and get some coffee if you'd like. Okay. Following the second panel, we hope you will all join us for a buffet lunch, which will also be set up over there, from the delicious West Springfield Taste of Lebanon restaurant. And during that time, we encourage you to maybe sit with other people, mix up a little bit, make some new friends, talk about what has emerged from the morning sessions. After lunch, we'll come together again to work in small groups, followed by a plenary discussion during which we'll ask our panelists to join us up front again as we discuss ways to move forward from here. You undoubtedly have noticed that there is a video camera here. Holyoke Media is graciously filming today's event. If there's anybody who absolutely does not want to appear on the film at all, you should identify yourself so that we can make sure that even as he's panning around to get the Q&A that maybe we put you back in the corner or somewhere like that. The small group discussions will not be filmed, other than perhaps a general pan to see what everybody's up to, but the speakers and the Q&A will be filmed by Holyoke Media and shared with Amherst Media as well. Bathrooms are located down the hall and around the corner. And finally, the obligatory cell phone reminder. If you could please put your phones either on mute or on vibrate. And if you do need to take a call or make a call, we ask that you just step outside the room and maybe step a little bit away from the room as well. Okay. So as Mehlaqa has been the main point of contact for all of our guests today, I'd like to ask her to come back up and introduce Rahsaan.
Thank you, Rachel. So it is now my profound privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today's event, Mr. Rahsaan Hall, who some of you might, or many of you might already know of. In case you didn't know, he was recently named as one of Boston's 100 most influential people. So everybody should know him, I guess. So Mr. Rahsaan Hall joins us from Boston, as I said. He is the director of the Racial Justice Program from the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. In this role, Rahsaan helps develop the ACLU of Massachusetts' integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues. Through legislative, advocacy, litigation, and community engagement, the program works on issues that deeply impact communities of color and historically disenfranchised communities. Rahsaan also manages the ACLU of Massachusetts' What a Difference a DA Makes campaign to educate state residents about the power and influence of district attorneys. We're very fortunate to have at least one of them here today with us. Prior to joining the ACLU of Massachusetts, Rahsaan was the Deputy Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, where his work included policy and legislative advocacy, community outreach, and maintaining a litigation caseload of voting rights, police misconduct, and public accommodations cases. So Rahsaan's bio is extremely long, as you might have guessed. However, you have all of that in your program brochure, so I won't read the entire thing. I'll just end with his academic credentials. Rahsaan is admitted to practice in Massachusetts and the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts. He is a graduate of the Ohio State University, where he got his bachelor's degree, Northeastern University School of Law, where he got his JD, and Andover Newton Theological School, where he got his master's in divinity. He is an ordained reverend in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Mr. Rahsaan.
Thank you, Mehlaqa, for that warm and generous introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's an honor for me to be here with you all today to talk about these very important issues that are very relevant, particularly when we're in the midst of a national conversation about whether or not NFL players can kneel during the anthem, and the president's role in condemning that without a reflection or comment on the significance behind why those players are protesting. One of the pieces that is in my bio, but I feel it's important for me to say, if for nothing else to give me a level of credibility on some of these issues, is that I spent 8 years in the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, where I prosecuted a variety of matters in district and superior court, from gang-related incidents, drug trafficking, and homicides. And so those experiences that I have significantly informed the work that I do today. And the work that I do, as well as the work that the American Civil Liberties Union has done for nearly 100 years, is rooted in the constitutional principles of freedom, liberty, justice, due process, and equality. The work that I do personally, or my motivations for this work, grow out of the spirit of abolition, that is abolition of prisons and abolition of police, and is also in the spirit of deconstructing or dismantling white supremacy. And when I say white supremacy, I'm not talking about neo-Nazis or skinheads or the alt-right. I am talking about a system that privileges, benefits, and centers white lives, values, behaviors, and beliefs to the exclusion and oftentimes detriment of people of color, particularly in America, Black people, Latino people, Native American people, or First Nation people. It's always important for me to acknowledge that as a framing for the conversations that I have, particularly with this nation's history and roots, being rooted in the genocide of First Nation people and the uncompensated and forced labor of African people brought here as slaves. When I talk about abolition of prisons and police, I'm not talking about disbanding police today, and I'm not talking about closing all the prisons today and just letting everybody out to run the streets and do what they want, but I'm talking about a vision of a future that we deserve to have, a vision of a reality that we can create. And if we do not talk about this vision, if we do not cast this vision, we will be relegated to the things that people proclaim are inevitable. This is a vision that is a real vision. And for those who are like, this guy is nuts, he's over here talking about some crazy leftist stuff. I'll just say that there was a point in this country when the notion of abolition of slavery was looked at as something that was nuts, because it was the cornerstone of this nation's economy. There was a whole civil war that was fought over the preservation of slavery. So to act as if the ideals of abolition are not valuable, that they should not be a framing for the conversations that we have for a society that we would want to see and live in, is a disservice to the legacy of so many people who fought, labored, and died for the notions of freedom. this conversation about law enforcement and communities of color usually centers around these notions of public safety and what is public safety. And it's important to tease that apart a little bit because from a traditional standpoint, public safety is viewed as restraint. It's about keeping bad people off of the street so that they don't do bad things to innocent people, to good people. That's a very noble and lofty ideal. But the ways that public safety is executed, particularly in poor communities and communities of color, does not rise to the lofty nature of those ideals and values that have been articulated by so many. And oftentimes, the narrative behind why public safety is important are usually racially tinged. There is a lengthy history in this country of describing people who are the bad actors, are the bad people. And when I say these, I'm speaking generally, but when you look in the aggregate, a lot of the narratives around who criminals are or who are the dangerous people that we need to be protected by disproportionately include people of color as nefarious individuals or the offender. This is not to say that white people don't commit crimes or that there are white people that have not committed significant offenses or that there are more white people in prisons. But relative to their representative population within the society, there's something amiss. When you look at media accounts of people who are accused of crimes, who have been charged with crimes, who have been convicted of crimes, when you look and listen to media accounts when there is a description of a perpetrator or a suspect in an event, rarely, if ever, do you hear the person described as white. But whenever it is a person of color, that is one of the defining characteristics that is included in the description. And so this narrative around public safety and who people, the public, are being kept safe from are rooted in racist ideologies that have existed from this nation's inception. And we need to continue to, if we haven't begun already, to interrogate those ideas and those values and how they inform our policies and practices. And this effort of public safety, colored through this narrative of racialized language, is being done in your names. It's being done in the names of people who are perceived to be the people who are worthy of protection from law enforcement, who are worthy of being cast as innocent victims. I say to you all, particularly those of you all in law enforcement, but also those of you all who are in community advocacy, that these things should no longer be done in our names, the way that they are being done. We have to have a vision of a new reality, of a new way of dealing with people. And so I encourage us to continue to engage in these meaningful and complicated dialogues. I talked about a vision of the future that we want to have, but it's important to kind of revisit the vision that led to the conditions that we currently exist in. What we see when we looked at what happened in Ferguson or what happened in Baltimore is nothing new. This grows out of a long history of oppression and resistance to oppression. So the vision of what has led to the conditions requires us to have an understanding of the vision of society at its inception. I'll start from slavery, because I think it's always important to have that conversation. And for the folks who are suffering from slavery fatigue, which is, why do we always have to talk about slavery? I never owned slaves. My grandparents didn't even own slaves. Why should I have to be responsible for engaging in this dialogue? And I say it's important for us to understand the roots of where these things come from, because in addition to slavery being an economic engine of this country, was also a form of social control. And then in 1865, when we have emancipation and the Reconstruction era, there is the introduction of federal troops to ensure that black people could live their lives in the South free from oppression and violation of their own individual rights and laws and appointments to federal positions. But when those federal troops were removed as a compromise of the presidency, of the Jackson administration, you see those troops removed and then an uprising of other forms of social control, mainly lynching. And so because these large populations of black folk needed to be kept in their place. And in addition to the threat and physical force of lynching, we also see the rise of black codes that criminalized black behavior. vagrancy laws for black folks. If you didn't have a job, you were subject to arrest and being taken into custody and being detained. There's a book by Douglas Blackman called Slavery by Another Name. You also see jobs or the rise of black codes for anti-miscegenation laws. For black people, they are not allowed to be in relationship with white people, and they were subject to a criminal offense. And so there is where you see the seeds and the roots of what we understand today now as mass incarceration. And from that period of time, since post-Reconstruction in 1889, Plessy v. Ferguson, or is it 69? Sorry. Plessy v. Ferguson, that declares that separate but equal is the law of the land. And we here in Massachusetts, where we suffer from what I like to call liberal exceptionalism, because we're a progressive state, we think that we always get it right. That language in Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court state, came from a Massachusetts case, where there was a black man that was suing to get his daughter into a school in Beacon Hill, because that used to be the black section of Boston, Beacon Hill, to get her into a school that was closer than the colored school that she had to walk to. That's here in Massachusetts, where that language that the Supreme Court later adopted came from. And so Jim Crow becomes the law of the land, and we have these acts of legalized discrimination and segregation and depriving black people of rights to employment, rights to housing, and an overwhelming increasing of police activity in communities of color. But it's not just individual acts of discrimination, because Jim Crow had an uncle, and his name was Sam. Uncle Sam, the federal government had a role in creating the disparities that exist in communities of color. When we look at redlining and blockbusting, federally backed loans would not go to communities that were designated as a red area or lined in red. And those were communities that were disproportionately larger numbers of black people who had fled to northern cities during the Great Migration, fleeing, not just looking for a better life, but fleeing racial oppression and violence. Those forms of social controls, those lynchings that were happening, their stores being taken from them, their homes being burned, them being threatened and intimidating for trying to vote and engage in the democratic process. That's what they were fleeing when they were going up to northern cities. But in addition to the redlining and the blockbusting, which devalued the price of homes in certain neighborhoods, GI bills that were liberally granted to veterans returning from the wars were disproportionately denied black soldiers. But also, when black soldiers did have the benefit of a GI bill, they couldn't go get a federally backed loan for a home because they were living in redlined districts. And then they couldn't get into schools to use that GI bill to further their education because black folks weren't allowed to go to white schools. And to the extent that they were able to get into historically black colleges and universities, there was an overwhelming number of people that were filling up the roles in those schools. And so these GIs, these black GIs that served their countries and sacrificed their lives, or their comrades sacrificed their lives or put their lives on the line, were then in schools where they were not allowed to get into schools, or were in schools that were over-enrolled. We look at the Federal Highway Administration and the funding that went into raising entire communities so that a highway could be placed from the downtown location to the outer suburbs in the midst of white flight. Because as all these black folks moved up north, white folks began to flee out to the suburbs. And in order to facilitate their access back and forth to the city from where they live, these federal funds went to building these highways. If any of you all have spent any time in Boston, the Southeast Corridor that runs from Boston through Roxbury, through Jamaica, was supposed to be where there was going to be a highway that would help facilitate white folks' flight back and forth from the city to the suburb. But people stood up and resisted, and now it's a subway line. But these are the things that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about the conditions of community where there are high rates of crime and high rates of poverty that are influencing that. And then in 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act, and then in 1965, we have the Voting Rights Act. So when we talk about a history of people's condition, let's begin with an understanding that freedom, quote unquote, came to black people in 1865. But since 1865, there were almost 100 years of legalized oppression, or 90 if you count Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. As the turning point where separate but equal was no longer the law of the land. And then from 1954 to 1964, then 1965, where we have full enfranchisement. So that's really what we're talking about if we're talking about people pulling themselves up from their bootstraps and having a level playing field. But that's even questionable, because when you look at the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's statistics on claims of racial discrimination, when you look at federal statistics on incidents of police misconduct and police violence in communities of color, it suggests to you, when you look at the denial rates or the declinations of home mortgages in black communities, it suggests to you that there's still not a level playing field from 1965 until now. And so, even in the midst of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, Johnson administration had invested in his war on crime, making sure that social service agencies could facilitate the uplifting of people in these large urban centers where there was a significant level of blight that they were seeing. But shortly thereafter, in the 65, 67, 68, there were these significant uprisings in black communities. And that's when we begin to see this pivot in the Johnson administration, and then taken on by the Nixon administration, from the war on crime, or excuse me, from the war on poverty to the war on crime. And that funding that was dedicated to social service agencies to fix the ills that existed within communities of color then shifted to funding law enforcement initiatives, police-based alternatives to addressing societal ills. Now, Dr. King, I want to lift up this quote from him in 1968. In this speech, The Other America, he said, "But it's not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without at the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what has America failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the promise of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity."
Right on.
And so when you look at what happened in Watts in LA, where you have a large segment of black people who had fled to the west from the south during the Great Migration, corralled into these communities with high poverty and low educational opportunities, and that they're being over-policed in these communities. And a precipitating event in 1965 is when the police pulled over Marquise Fry. And when the community saw how they were treating Marquise, his mother and his brother, they pushed his mother to the ground. That enraged the community, and the police responded with greater levels of force. And you see 3 days of rioting or uprising and resistance in Watts. Or similarly in Chicago in 1966, a very similar situation where there are significant numbers of African Americans who have fled oppression in the South, and a growing number of Puerto Ricans that are filling the Chicago neighborhood in these communities where they are corralled in the areas where there are high levels of poverty and high concentration of substandard housing and low educational opportunity and low economic opportunities as well, and an over-policing and acts of misconduct. And the police chased this young man named Acelius Cruz and shot him in the back of the leg as he was running from them. The community saw that, and in light of all of the suffering and oppression that they had been subjected to, they resisted and raised up. Or when you think about in 1966 in Newark, New Jersey, very similar conditions where black people were fleeing the South up to the north and were corralled in these communities of high poverty and low educational opportunity and substandard housing, and being over-policed by police that used aggressive tactics. And there was a young man that was, let me get this right, it was not Cruz, but John Weird Smith, who was a cab driver, and he was stopped by the police and then taken unconscious into the police precinct. And when the community saw this, they stood up and they resisted, and there was this uprising for 6 days. And when you think about Baltimore, the similar situation where there are these black folks who fled oppression in the South, and they were corralled in these communities where there were high concentrations of poverty, low educational opportunity, high rates of substandard housing, and a history of being over-policed in aggressive ways. And then on April 25th, the police arrested Fred Gray and took him and put him in a van and drove him, and he sustained life-threatening injuries. And the people resisted and spoke up because they were not being heard. And in the midst of this, in the early 70s, there was a man by the name of Pat Murphy, who some folks in law enforcement might recognize, who's known as the father of kind of modern community policing. He came up in the ranks from New York as a patrolman. His father and grandfather were police officers, but he's the one who kind of developed this notion of anti-crime units, putting officers in plain clothes and allowing them to operate in the communities. And this way of policing became very problematic. There was a situation where they were in plain clothes or oftentimes in disguise, and there was an incident between two young women, and one of the women had a shotgun during an altercation. And when the police showed up, they pulled their weapons out, recognizing that she had a shotgun, but she didn't know that they were law enforcement officers. And when she pulled the shotgun to shoot at someone that she thought was a threat to them, they shot her and killed her. And not her, but the woman that she was standing next to. But that was just one example of the many that this force, this anti-crime force that Pat Murphy had initiated. And his mantra was that the greatest sign of the strength of a police department is its number of arrests. And so this notion of stemming the tide of crime in these tough urban centers was premised around high levels of arrests in these communities. And this is very problematic, and it continues today, and there are a lot of departments that now say they like to take a soft approach and that they try to engage community members more directly and more frequently and have police athletic leagues and put their officers, to the extent that that exists anymore, but police officers and school resource officers in the schools to engender a relationship with the police and with law enforcement in general. But that doesn't speak to the rest of what's happening in the police departments. And it also doesn't speak to the way that the law has allowed policing to exist. There is what my colleague Matt Siegel, the legal director of the ACLU of Massachusetts, likes to describe as the architecture of policing. There are certain cases that have existed, Supreme Court precedent, that allow police to do the things that they do that raise so much concern in communities of color. When you think about Tennessee v. Garner, where the legitimacy of a state statute that authorized officers to use whatever reasonable force necessary to stop a threat to either themselves or the public, this particular officer shot a young man in the back of the head who was suspected of a burglary. And they said that he did not, in that particular instance, meet the requirements of the statute, but the statute in and of itself, that reasonableness metric of the statute, was appropriate. And then you have the subsequent case, Graham v. Connor, where there's a man in Connecticut who's suffering from a diabetic shock, and a friend of his takes him to the convenient mart, and because he's going through diabetic shock, his behaviors and actions look a little erratic, and he runs into the convenience mart. He sees that there's a long line. He just needs to get some orange juice, so he comes back out and gets the car, and there's an officer who's watching it and thinks that his behavior is of ill design. And so they follow him and they stop him, and because he's in diabetic shock, he gets out of the passenger seat and begins to walk around the car muttering inherently, and the police officer tries to restrain him. The friend who's driving him says he's suffering from diabetic shock. The officer says, no, he's not, he's just drunk. And in the midst of trying to explain what's happening, this man is thrown up against the car. He breaks a rib and his cheekbone, and when the court reviews what the officer's actions were, they determined that it was reasonable, given the officer's understanding and training, to perceive what was going on in that incident. And so you have those types of precedent that govern police conduct and behavior. And so when we see these incidents, the reasonable perception of threat that officers fear that their lives are endangered is justified. Even when hindsight 2020, we understand as a community that there was no reason for an officer to think that 12-year-old Tamir Rice was going to be a threat to his life, given the split-second response that that officer had, pulling up, hopping out the car, and within a matter of seconds shooting. And then there's Wren v. U.S., the case of racial profiling, or driving while black. Essentially, these officers saw a vehicle, they saw these individuals in this vehicle and suspect them of being involved in something, and so they began to follow them, and they failed to use their directional when making a turn. But the pretextual reason, right, is the signal infraction is a pretextual reason to make a stop based on these officers observing these black men driving through this neighborhood. And the court upheld that, saying as long as there's a motor vehicle infraction that justifies their behavior, that it's okay. We here in Massachusetts tried to argue against the state analog of Brand versus U.S., a case that went up to the state Supreme Court. And here's something that is very telling about society's understanding of how policing happens. We're challenging this notion that pretextual stops are okay. And in the argument, and we make that argument because there's ample evidence that shows that there are racial disparities in who gets stopped relative to the population of who's driving on the streets. There's ample evidence that shows that Black and Latino drivers, when they are stopped by police, are more likely to be treated aggressively and have a hostile experience. There's ample evidence to show also that this is just bad policing, because even though white people are stopped less frequently, there's a higher hit rate, meaning that you're more likely to recover contraband when white people are stopped than when Black and Latino people are stopped. And so that either says that people are just confused and they're getting it wrong, or it says you better have a damn good reason if you're stopping a white person. But it's those types of behavior, those cases that allow for this type of behavior. And we think about law enforcement and community of color relationships, we have to understand that it's not just what police do, but it's also what the law allows. I was just watching this morning the situation of Sterling Brown, who's a player for the Milwaukee Bucks. Back in January, he parked illegally at like a convenience mart at 2 in the morning, ran into the store to get something, came back out. When he came out, there was a Milwaukee police officer that was standing near his car. Brown tries to get in his car, the officer tells him back up, back up, back up. And essentially Brown is being questioned as to why he parked illegally. So instead of citing him, the officer begins to engage him aggressively, questioning him. Brown feels like he doesn't have to answer anything. Just give me the ticket for the illegal parking violation and I'll be on my way. The officer calls back, 6 cars arrive, and then it turns into a struggle and Sterling Brown is tased for parking illegally. And so going back to our state analog of motor vehicle cases and stops, during the argument of that case, this notion of pretextual stops and what they lead to, one of the justices, when questioning the witnesses, or one of the attorneys for the case said, but aren't pretextual stops a good thing? Don't pretextual stops lead to recovery of evidence? Guns get recovered when you stop people for traffic violations. Drugs get recovered when you stop people for traffic violations. You find people who are wanted on sexual assault when you stop people for traffic violations. Doesn't pretextual stops, or don't pretextual stops do good things? Don't pretextual stops save lives? Our response to the court is that when doing the calculus of determining whether or not a pretextual stop is a good thing and whether or not they save lives, we must remember that Black lives matter as well. And this is in light of the evidence that shows the disparities in how people are treated when they're stopped by police. And that is part of what Black Lives Matter is advocating for. It's advocating for reform, it's advocating for the respecting of Black lives, it's advocating for a new way of policing in communities of color that is less militaristic, less hostile. But it's also advocating for the reforms of the things that have created the conditions in communities of color where there are higher rates of poverty. It's talking about reform of our incarceration system. The United States of America only has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. And when you look within that number, you know, it's like 63% are African American. Yet we only make up 13% of the nation's population. Here in Massachusetts, when you think about disparities in policing, we have one of the lowest incarceration rates in the world, and many folks will say, we don't have a problem with mass incarceration here. Okay, fine. If you want to argue about being the best of the worst, because of Massachusetts, we're its own nation, we have the 11th highest incarceration rate in the world. And even if that's fine, right, even if you're okay with that, we have racial disparity in Massachusetts that outpaces the national racial disparity. So again, liberal exceptionalism here in Massachusetts, we're not doing it that well, because the national disparity rate between Black and white is 6 to 1. Massachusetts, 8 to 1. So we got a lot of work to do. When you think about mandatory minimum drug sentences and people who are serving those types of sentences, Black and Latino people only make up 23% of the population, but they make up 54% of the people who are serving sentences in incarcerated facilities, 57% of the people who are serving drug sentences, but then when you look at mandatory minimum sentences, that number jumps up to 75%. And that's in face of evidence that shows Blacks and Latinos use and sell drugs at relatively the same rates as whites. Now, we can have an argument about the way that that happens and the type of drug transactions, street level transactions, etc. But I bet you if you ran up into UMass Amherst or Smith or Mount Holyoke or any of these other institutions and started conducting drug operations, you'd have a very different demographic of who's being arrested for drug offenses. So to that notion that, well, that's where the crime is, I refute that. The way that law enforcement plays out in immigration is also problematic. As well, the use of 287G agreements and how that destabilizes community trust in law enforcement. Whether or not somebody is undocumented should not be a reason for them not to feel like they can trust local law enforcement. But it's not just the police, it's also the district attorneys. I'm glad to see District Attorney Sullivan here. The DA, the ACLU has launched its What a Difference a DA Makes campaign that is committed to raising awareness about the role, the power, and the influence of district attorneys and how they can impact so much of the criminal legal system. And I say criminal legal as opposed to criminal justice, because when you think about all of the disparities and inequities that exist within this system, it's hard to call it a system of justice. But one of the things that we did is we did some polling. We found out that 4 in 10 Massachusetts voters didn't know that the DA was an elected official. But then we also found out that after being engaged on the topics about the role, power, and influence of district attorney, 81% were more likely to go out and vote and pay attention to DA races. And so we endeavored to raise awareness so that people can know that this is one of the most powerful individuals within the system that many people have never heard of. From charging decisions to bail requests to turning over discovery that may or may not be exculpatory to sentencing recommendations to leveraging guilty pleas through mandatory minimum sentences and through law reform or interfering with law reform. This major criminal law reform bill that just passed the House and the Senate and was signed by the governor was opposed. Various portions of it were opposed by the Massachusetts District Attorneys Association. Of the 11 district attorneys, 9 of them signed on. I'm glad to say that one of them that did not sign on is here today. That is something that is worthy of some praise. That is something that is worthy of some praise. So finally, a vision of the future is one where there is a way to deal with people who have offended and harmed without resorting to warehousing people in cages. The overwhelming numbers of victims of violent crimes have been surveyed and have said that the system is not working. 76% said that they would prefer to see a system that is more rehabilitative than retributive. And so again, thinking about what's being done in your name, these are the victims of violent crimes who have been surveyed in full and said that they would rather see a more rehabilitative system than one that is retributive. We need to recognize that in many communities, hurt people hurt people. And so we need to take a trauma-informed approach to how policing happens, how prosecution happens, how restoration happens in communities, particularly poor communities and communities of color. We need to have more mental health services available. We need to have more drug treatment and job training and educational opportunities and increased reentry support and restorative justice alternatives. We will need to develop institutions that no longer warehouse people in cages for the mere purpose of restraint and retribution and subject them to punishment and torture. So in the meantime, until we have lived into that vision of a future that we don't have prisons as we understand them now, and that we don't have police in the way that we understand them now, we need to work on, one, diversity. We need to begin to diversify our law enforcement agencies. Not that diversity is a panacea, because it's more about the culture, but the more people of diverse backgrounds, the more Black and brown folks, the more women, the more queer folks that you get in these law enforcement agencies, the more these agencies will begin to change. Two, we need to have body-worn cameras. Now, as ACLU, as a freedom-loving and privacy-concerned organization, this is a tough needle for us to thread, but we believe that it is an important accountability metric if and only if it is accompanied by a strong public policy that requires strong privacy protections. We have a model bill or model model policy for municipalities to embrace. Data analysis. Data analysis is key. We advocated, the ACLU advocated for that to be included in this criminal bill, criminal justice bill, or criminal law reform bill. And as a result, the collection and reporting of arrest data is now required for all departments in a consistent format. But we also did some public records requests from the Executive Office of Public Safety, and so we've got some arrest data from all of the municipalities within Massachusetts on low-level arrests. And what we've seen is that there are huge racial disparities in a lot of cities and towns when you look at who's being arrested relative to their representation in the general population. Community engagement is also something that is hugely important, whether or not it's a civilian oversight board or it's a way to have a complaint process that is meaningful, that is substantive, and that takes seriously the concerns, the complaints, the requests, and the vision of the people in the community. It is explicitly important to ensure that we are including immigrant communities, to make sure that our undocumented brothers and sisters that are here with us feel the full protection of law enforcement. We need to reinvest in people as opposed to reinvesting or investing in institutions. A greater reduction in the amount of people that we are caging can be more money that is being freed up to service people on the front end so that they never come into the system to begin with. And so when we define our reality in terms, language, and actions that break the manacles of inevitability and charge headlong into a future that is rooted in the constitutional principles of freedom, liberty, equality, due process, and justice. When we center ourselves in the principles that grow out of healthy communities, that heal broken people, when we invest in people and their futures instead of their deficiencies, we will look back at this moment in history and proclaim that we refuse to be imprisoned and policed by systems of social control and oppression, and we have realized our vision. Thank you.
Working now? Excellent.
What?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We don't have a whole lot of time since we got started a little bit late, but I do want to open it up for questions, answers, comments. Great. And if you could just introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, my name is Kent Alexander. Thank you very much for an impassioned, truthful, as far as where I sit. My question to you is, Michelle Alexander in her book, she later stepped down out of complete focusing only on the social and removed herself more, as she said in writing. I haven't talked to the woman, but the religious side, the spiritual side of things. And I'm curious, as I see that you are an ordained minister in the AME Church, how that sensibility and your own sensibility, how those come together, if you could?
Sure, thank you for raising that. I think that's a very poignant reflection of Michelle Alexander. She's like, it's not going to be lawsuits that change what's happening, but it's more of a hearts and minds campaign that's really going to change the way that policing and the criminal legal system or criminal punishment system is executed in this society. And she has gone on to, I believe, Union Theological Seminary to further her work in this regard. And so I look at, understanding movements and the lasting legacy. The unfulfilled dream of Dr. King is really this poor people's campaign. Right. It's not just about racial unity, but it's about poverty and pulling up people out of poverty and having a society in which people can live and productive lives, and that comes out of this religious ethos, at least from my perspective. The parable of Christ, when asked by his disciples, right, who is going to enter into the kingdom, and he gives the analogy of a king who spoke to many of the other nations and said, when I was poor, you were there for me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you came to visit me. That which you have done unto the least of these, you have done unto me. And so when we think about who are the least of these in our societies, we look at communities of color, we look at people who struggle with mental illness, we look at undocumented people, we look at sexual minorities in this country. And so those are the people who are kind of at the most vulnerable positions in our society, and our advocacy needs to be one that speaks to the needs of those people, and all of the other things begin to come into place. Fannie Lou Hamer once said, nobody's free until everybody's free.
Thank you.
How are you?
Good.
Good to see you again, my friend. David Runner, I have a question. When you think about a municipality around the country that's doing it well, that is really, in a sense, understanding many of the issues you have laid out as it relates to improving policing, what municipalities come to mind, and what has been the catalyst why it has taken place?
Yeah, that's always a challenging question for me, because for every department that may have a civilian oversight board that's doing, some exceptional things, or for every department that has adopted willingly body-worn cameras, or for every department that has, of its own volition, included bias-based policing or anti-racism training even. I think those are positive things. But again, from a position of abolition, we don't want to build up things that we're later going to have to tear down. So, I can look at, the Seattle Police Department, right? There are some things that Boston has done that have increased initiatives to increase diversity. So, those are some things that we look at and that we reflect on, but to single them out as an example becomes problematic, because then when they do something, when there's an officer or a division within that department that has run afoul of the law, or has just operated in a way that is, at the very least, unbecoming of an officer or the department, or at the worst, gross misconduct, what does that then say about how we assess that department when we just held them up as an example? So I back away from saying, here's a place that does it right.
I appreciate that response, but would we not judge that municipality by how they responded to an officer who created a level of misconduct and approach? Shouldn't we judge them by how they chose to deal with that officer? So even if it happens, you got 500 police officers in a municipality, if you have one that is a bad actor, that is overtly obvious as the example you gave, shouldn't we therefore then judge by how the police force choose to deal and discipline, or whether keep that person in their employment? Would that not be also a sign of something positive if it was done?
I mean, I think that's one of the metrics to evaluate them on how they deal with the individual, if it is an individual. But to me, again, the conversation isn't about the act of individuals or the behavior or conduct, but it's about the culture that allowed that type of conduct and behavior to happen in the first place. So we can reward people for doing the things that they're supposed to do, but what do we say about them when they never did the things that they were supposed to do to prevent something like that from happening? Now, granted, police departments cannot stop everybody from doing every bad thing, but I think that there is a significant way, or there are ways to significantly stem the tide of misconduct and mistreatment. It's rooted in the nature of how policing happens, this level of kind of machismo and command presence that dictate how policing happens. And that, kind of broken windows notion of policing. And not all departments do that or embrace that, but that culture, because you've got young officers coming on the force with officers who have been on the job for 20, 30, 15, 20 years. They're seniors saying, okay, that's what you learned in training, but this is how it works on the street.
Your questions?
Thank you very much for your impassioned and historically informed speech. This was really eye-opening for me, and it brings up a question. Of course, the focus of today is policing and the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color in this nation. But I can't help but think about the many parallels between American imperialism and American militarism and policing. I'm wondering if you can speak to the intersections and the tensions between the work of police reform nationally and efforts against imperialism and militarism nationally and internationally, specifically with regards to American militarism.
My take on that issue is when we think about the militarization of the police forces and the conversation around police reform, those are part and parcel of the same movement, and if they're not in dialogue together, they need to be. The intersectionality of advocacy initiatives and movements it's important for them to embrace all of the things that are impacting communities. And so, when you have an increase in funding for decommissioned military equipment to go to local law enforcement, and I don't have the stats offhand, but we've requested information from regional kind of tactical teams, IMLEC teams. And what we found is the overwhelming majority of the use of that equipment and those tactical squads is to execute drug lords, right? It's not like we're breaking down doors of terrorists, right? It's not like we're disrupting plots to overthrow the United States government. We're not recovering huge caches of weapons in those instances. There are some instances where that happens, but mostly it has been around warrant apprehension and drug incidents. And granted, there's a lot of violence associated in some instances with the drug trade, and the distribution, the illegal distribution of drugs is a problem, and it's a conversation that we need to have when we think about decriminalizing drugs and the values. You look at Portugal, you look at Sweden, you look at other nations. Now, the distinction I draw between those nations and America, those are generally largely homogeneous societies where folks feel like I'm okay with my government dollars going to dealing with people in a more humane and trauma-informed way. But here, when folks feel entitled to say, I don't want my tax dollars going to those people, and the othering that happens, it becomes problematic. So I don't know that that necessarily gets to the heart of what you were asking, but that's kind of my perspective on those issues. Last plug, or you have a question. I encourage you all to visit our I mentioned our What a Difference a DA Makes campaign. Please visit our website, www.dadifference.org. There are a huge number of ways. There are a lot of ways to get involved. We have court watch trainings, we have canvassing opportunities. We're going to host a debate between candidates in each of the 6 contested districts. And I have to say that is unprecedented in Massachusetts over the last 20 years. DA races, 77% of DA races have been uncontested, right? And so that stifles the democratic process. That denies the public an opportunity to hear from candidates for the district attorney and what their policy and prosecution priorities are and what is their approach to reforming the system and reducing the racial disparities. And so now I'd like to claim a little bit of the credit for there being 6 contested races in 1 year. That's unprecedented. So it's a really, I think, important conversation for everyone to be involved in. And even if you're not interested in getting engaged, go to dadifference.org and see what other folks are doing to talk about.
Thank you so much, Rahsaan. I just want to sort of go back to what David Rudder had mentioned about, model police stations or model municipalities. And I just wanted to sort of ask you, your vision is, for the future, is an abolition of the prison system altogether, right? But in the meantime, if there are law enforcement agencies that are trying to do better or are trying to sort of improve conditions on the ground at the community level, I think what you implied by your earlier statement was that really doesn't matter, because in the end we're going to dismantle all of that anyway, and that leaves then little room for reform. Because then I guess, and I'm just sort of thinking about this as I speak, is that what you're saying is then that we have to completely work out of the system and not work within the system to improve it. Is that what you're saying? Because then what happens until we achieve that ideal vision? What happens at the local level as we're trying to aspire towards that larger vision? And what room does that leave for improvement?
Yeah, and so I think what happens is it doesn't have to be, this harsh binary, right? That it can only be one or the other. The unadulterated principle is that we don't want to build up things that we'll later have to tear down. But is there a way to create things within what already exists that doesn't broaden the footprint of law enforcement, but narrows and refines it and makes it more humane, so that then it gets us to a better place, right? And you think about the amount of cases that come through a particular county's court system. We got data from Suffolk County for 2013 and 2014. 96% of those cases were district court cases. And not to say that there aren't serious cases that come through the district court, but an overwhelming majority of cases where there are disproportionately large number of people being held are property and motor vehicle offenses. Now granted, I understand that there's this sense that if people are driving around uninsured, that's problematic, because if they hit someone and get in an accident, that they can't be held accountable. But do we need to rely on the criminal legal system and law enforcement to enforce that as a society? So these are some of the challenging questions that we have to ask. And then, is jail or prison always the appropriate alternative or solution for these societal ills? And the argument is, even if you reduce the number of incarcerated people, there are still fixed costs of the institutions. You have to pay salaries, you have to pay contracts for housing and cleaning and food and other services that are provided there. My whole argument is that I understand that those are fixed costs, but they're on a contract, and those contracts expire. And if there is a significant enough reduction in the overall population, that facilities begin to close, because we are doing something better for people, something that is different. There's still this conversation around restraint, how we keep dangerous people from hurting other people. And there's a significant number of people who are incarcerated, probably the majority of the people who are incarcerated for violent offenses. But we also have to have a conversation about what that means, what is a violent offense, but then also when there is significant and real harm, what is the best thing for them? Because 95–97% of people who are serving sentences are ultimately going to be released one day. And what are the conditions that they are being detained and held in that prepare them to be released back into society? I want the person that's had the benefit of treatment and healing and recovery and restorative justice practices, so that they have found a level of accountability while detained, as opposed to just punishment.
Last question, since I see a hand here.
Thank you. I've worked in community mental health for most of my professional life, and one of the biggest obstacles for some people who have been arrested, or people who have been, convicted of crimes, is that when they're trying to get employment, their record has come up, even if things have been dismissed, even if it's just an arrest with no conviction, disorderly conduct, assault and battery on a police officer. These things seem to follow people along forever. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, but also about what's might be changing in this new Massachusetts bill.
Right. So there are several offenses that have historically not been able to be sealed. One of those was disturbing the peace. That's been modified. There are also some provisions to capture some of the loopholes that existed For people who are applying for occupational licenses, that sealing, those sealed records were still available to the agencies. That's been reformed, and now expungement has been created. Sealing a record is different from expungement. Sealing the record still exists. It just says on the record sealed, whatever the charge was. Whereas expungement, the record of that incident is completely removed. And there was a lot of resistance in that from law enforcement because it said we need to know who these folks are who are out here, but that's in tension with how do we allow people to continue to move on with their lives once they've paid their debts to society. Professor Bruce Weston just did this major study that studied cohorts of individuals who were paroled and or just released from prison, looking at recidivism. And overwhelmingly, again, thinking about this through a racialized lens, who is being recycled back into or funneled back into the system, and it is disproportionately people of color. When you compare this cohort, the white people in the cohort and the black people in the cohort, the white people were more able to get back on their feet, get a trade union job because of somebody that they knew, have housing that they could live in because they have a family member that's not living on subsidized housing so that they could go to that place, whereas some of the individuals who were black were going back to communities, either A, where there was somebody that they were living with who was on subsidized housing, so that eliminated their ability to be in there, or they were in communities that were over-policed and had a high concentration of people who were convicted. Mass Inc. did a study called The Geography of Incarceration, and there were certain communities in the city of Boston where every other household was being touched by the Suffolk County House of Corrections or the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department, meaning either there was somebody currently in the House of Corrections or in the jail on pretrial detention, or somebody who had just recently been released. And the amount of money spent on either detaining or releasing those folks far exceeded the amount of money that was spent on Bunker Hill Community College and Roxbury Community College combined. So when we think about what we are doing to help people re-enter society successfully, we have to think about the full picture. Quarry ceilings and reforming the law in that way are some of the solutions, but there has to be housing opportunities and job opportunities and counseling and therapy. We can think about what happens to people while they're detained, what's happening to them in solitary confinement, and the levels of trauma that they are being exposed to, and the lack of treatment that they're getting. There's a couple sheriff's departments that are doing it right and trying to create more therapeutic settings, but we've got to do it.
Thank you very much. Thanks.